not to say that to a large extent, the black market, one step was demonetization, and now we are hearing that other steps will also be taken, and one to a large extent GST will also help eradicate this so-called black market. Now, you know what happens because of this, say for example, matching principle, right? So again, borrowing or taking a cue from the deliberation that I heard from Sushil ji, he said that एक अच्छी मछली पूरे तालाब को गंदा कर देती है. Have you heard this?
First session we have discussed it.
So the idea is that because of this credit matching, now to a large extent, even if one person reports the transaction, how the others will have to fall in line. So not to mention that obviously GST will have its pluses also. Having said that, so what is the taxable event under GST? Supply. Now the concept is time of supply and place of supply. Now, see, supply is taxable event that we have agreed on. But does supply instigate the payment of GST? Answer is no. So you have a taxable event which is supply. So there will be an implication of GST. But it is the time of supply which will help you know when the liability towards GST arises. Am I clear? Now you will ask me, what is place of supply? The place of supply is that concept which will help you understand whether IGST will be payable or whether CGST and SGST will be payable. So you have a concept of time of supply which is very similar to the concept of point of taxation rules that you have today, which determines when the liability to GST will arise, and the place of supply will help you determine what GST is payable, whether it is CGST and SGST or whether it is IGST. Before I move any further, first I would like to know from you, what do you mean by IGST? Yeah, come on, after deliberations of like, I have spoken for 40 minutes, he's spoken for 2 hours, you can't say IGST is integrated. Full form तो सबको ही पता है. जो full form आप गलत बोलते वो मैंने पहले ही पूछ लिया. No. Say for instance, I'll give you an example. Because I had this confusion which was clarified only in the Train the Trainers program when I attended that. So say for example, the rate of SGST in Bengal is 10%. And the CGST rate is again 10%. CGST is a central GST, so it will be common across board. Now, the rate in Maharashtra, as far as SGST is concerned, as I said, they get a certain band within which they can tamper the rate. So the rate in Maharashtra is 9%. So what is IGST? IGST is, literally speaking, a summation of CGST and SGST, but where you have the different CGSTs, different SGSTs, it has to be the lowest of the SGSTs plus the common CGST. Why IGST? IGST will apply in cases where there is an interstate what? Supply of goods and or services, and whenever there is an intrastate supply of goods and or services, then CGST and SGST will apply. The rate of CGST will be common across board. Talking about SGST, it will be as per the relevant state act. Now, having said that, now none of you all are carrying the model GST law. I don't have a PPT, so I'll be reading the relevant section and the subsection, and then we'll be having a few discussions on that. So they say that the liability will arise at the time of the relevant section or clause, I beg your pardon for again using the word section, is section 12 of the CGST and the SGST Act. And when you talk about the time of supply of services, that is section 13 of the model GST law. So they say that the liability, the time of supply of goods, now we'll be discussing, will there be any difference between goods and services once GST is in place?
No, there is no difference. Only the time.
Let's divide the audience again. This side, please. Yes or no?
Definition has been given separately for goods and services.
So today there is a lot of hue and cry. Give me one example which is very litigative talking about goods or services. Works contract? Even the states want a chunk of the pie and even the center wants the chunk of the pie, and you still have litigation going on whether इसमें service tax लगेगा, VAT लगेगा या दोनों लगेगा. Now when you talk about works contract, let me tell you that the constitution does not give the right either to the center or the state to define the term. But for the limited purposes, each state and even the center has gone to describe what works contract is. One plus of GST, I would say, is that they have now made it very clear that works contract for the limited purposes of GST will be treated as services. So we remember we were talking about schedules to the GST law. So you also have a schedule 1 wherein they mention what will be treated as goods and what will be treated as services. And there they have mentioned precisely that works contract will be treated as goods. So there are goods for the purposes of GST. There are goods which will be treated as goods. There are services which will be treated as services. And then there are goods which will be treated as services. Are we clear on that? So keeping that concept in mind, when we talk about goods which are normally understood to be goods and plus the ones which have been given under the specific schedule to the law, they say that the time of supply of goods will be the earliest of the following, and then they give on to again divide that into two parts. A, whether goods are required to be removed, and B, whether goods are not required to be removed. So we are first concentrating on the first limb of this relevant section, which says that in cases where the goods are required to be removed, first let's discuss. So goods required to be removed, in 90% of the cases you have scenarios where the goods are required to be removed. These include, say, normal stock transfer from the factory to the head office or from the factory to the warehouse, normal movement of goods, which is ideally in case of 90% of the goods. There they say that the following events have to occur, and the earliest of the following will determine the time of supply of goods. A, the date on which the goods are removed by the supplier to the recipient. B, the date on which the supplier issues an invoice. C, the date on which supplier receives the payment against the supply. D, the date on which the recipient shows the receipt of goods in his books of accounts. Right? So what are the four events? First point. First is the date on which the goods are removed for the purpose of supplying to the receiver. Second is invoice. Third is, fourth is, fourth is something where I have a major problem and which can pose a challenge. The fourth says the date on which the recipient shows the receipt of goods in his books of accounts. Now you see, I will now, as a supplier, to determine where is or when is the time of supply arising, will need to be dependent upon my recipient to find out, भाई आपने कब receipt दिखाया अपने books में. So that is a challenge, number one. Number two, they say the date on which the supplier receives the payment. So as on date, you are paying service tax on advances, but here we are talking about goods. Are you paying any VAT on advance? Are you paying any central excise on advance? Even when you talk about revenue recognition, I think the accounting standard is 9. When do you recognize revenue in your books of accounts? Advance is not treated as a revenue. So now you will have a scenario wherein also there will be some sort of a mismatch between your books for the limited purposes of GST and your books as per Income Tax Act. Because now, to the extent of the advance that you have received against these goods, GST will be required to be paid, because the time of supply will set to have arise the minute you receive the advance in your books. So the earliest of the four will be the time of supply as far as a case is concerned where the goods are required to be removed. Are we clear on this? But as I said, it's very, very difficult for you as a supplier to actually find out from the recipient कि भाई आपने अपने बुक्स में कब उसको रिसीट दिखाया है. And also in a scenario where goods are required to be removed, how can I as a receiver show a receipt till and unless आपने movement किया हो goods का, and आपका movement तो already point A में covered है.
Can be close to be mine.
Okay, I thought I have got as good a voice as Mamta Banerjee, but nonetheless. So anyway, what was the first clause? The first clause was the date on which you have removed, and they say earliest of the following. So the last clause is the date on which the recipient shows the receipt of goods in his books of accounts. So I cannot foresee a situation where the recipient has shown the receipt but the goods have not been moved by the supplier. So maybe this has been done to basically take within fold those transactions where the supplier does not show a certain movement record of supply from his end in his books. That is one. Now they talk about the second one. Now there are far too many issues, but because of paucity of time, we'll be quickly going through the time of supply of goods and services, right? And not going into more of examples. Otherwise, there are a lot of examples that you can get into.
In this case, loss in transit. Goods lost in transit.
Goods lost in transit. So lost in as in, how does it address this?
It is not reaching to the receiver.
हाँ, no, but आपने तो movement दिखा दिया है ना? So वही तो बात है. The idea is कि how can 4 occur before 1?
Yes.
So basically, ideally 4 is irrelevant. It's redundant. But anyway,
There are cases.
there are cases where the
There are
supplier.
cases when you supply to, say, suppose government or big organizations, they have the inspection system. You send the goods on approval basis, then they inspect.
Sir, for goods sent on approval, there is a separate subsection that deals with that.
That says that when the receiver receives, after inspection, they communicate to the department that we have accepted your goods. Then you raise the
Sir, that
invoice.
is exactly
So
the
which
point.
action?
In case of sale on approval,
But the
in
moment
case
you are
of-
not transferring the title, so the tax.
sir, let me tell you. Let me now bring you back, please. A, there is no concept of transfer of title left once GST is in place. As far as the supply has occurred, as in it's a taxable event of supply, then you have to determine the time of supply. There will be no concept of transfer of property
Then the
left.
question of lost in transit will come.
Secondly, also when I talk about the sale on approval basis, there is a separate subsection under section 12 that deals with the case that what will be the time of supply when the goods are sent on approval basis. So again, we can't say that that will be covered by this. So by and large, in a scenario where the supplier does not show the movement, then probably this case will come, or in case of reverse charge of goods. Nonetheless, the earliest of the following will determine the time of supply in case of goods which require movement. Now comes the other part of this same section, section 12 subsection 2, which says that what will be the time of supply in a case where the goods are not required to be removed. So all the three events remain the same, only the first event says that the date when the goods are made available to the recipient will be the first date, and the other 3 dates will be the same as we discussed. So to my mind, when you talk about goods not required to be removed in the auto sector or in the aerospace sector, you have a concept of OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, wherein say for example Maruti has a contract with me and I am their OEM to make original parts for their car. So I have to prepare the mold for those precision parts, and when I manufacture the mold, that is not removed to Maruti, though the supply has occurred. I use that for making these precision tools. So that may be a case where the goods are not required to be removed. Another very crude example you can talk about, you come to my showroom and you want a mobile. So I give you the mobile. So here again the goods are not really required to be removed by me. So such instances, they say, will be covered by section 12 subsection 2 clause A2, wherein the earliest of the 4 events will determine what is the time of supply for those specific goods.
Residential flat purchase not required to be removed.
So anyway, residential flat is not goods. If it's a pure sale,
we are promoter. We used to do this.
Works contract will now come within the fold of services, and immovable property is not goods. So when you are selling a flat as a flat, there is no question of GST on that. The minute it's a works contract, then it comes under the place of supply of services, which will be dealt with under section 13. So the earliest of the four will determine what is the time of supply in cases where the goods are not required to be removed. तो जब आपने available कर दिया है उसको, चाहे वो क्या करे उसका, तब आपका वो time of supply का first clause determine हो जाएगा. And what are the remaining clauses? Issue of invoice, receipt of payment, and third is again a challenge that how will he understand when the recipient is showing a receipt of goods in his books of accounts. And hence on this front it's a challenging issue. Yes sir?
Say a goods is received but GRN is made after some time. GRN is basically made when it will be inspection will be completed. It's not that approval basis. It's normal practice of the trade or business that you the goods is received say for a particular date, but after inspection 10 days and then quality testing etc. then if it is accepted then GRN is prepared.
Now you say if it's accepted. The minute you say if it's accepted, that makes it fall within the ambit of sale on approval basis, wherein there is a time frame of 6 months within which the goods need to be approved. If not, depending upon the specific subsection, the time of supply will set to have occurred. And in a case where you can establish that the goods are not on approval, then you have to determine these four events. A, have you issued an invoice? Answer is, say for instance, no. Have you received the payment? In your example, have you received any payment?
Yeah.
No. Advance, to the extent of advance, you have to anyway pay. As I said, it's a new concept of paying GST in case of advance received on goods, which until now was not the case as far as VAT and excise is concerned. But people within the service tax ambit are by and large very used to this concept of paying service tax on advance. In fact, people are also issuing invoices to the tune of advances that they have received as far as service tax is concerned. And then carrying forward your example, the fourth is you have to find out bhai aapne apne books mein receipt dikhaya hai ki nahi. And first is in case in your example the goods require movement, to aapne movement kar diya. Earliest of the four will determine what is the time of supply, and accordingly you will have to disburse your GST liability. Quickly moving forward then.
Turnkey project is a very good example made available to you.
Yeah, so as I said initially, we have a small, it was your speaker who's tomorrow, I think Tarun is taking your session tomorrow or whenever next your workshop is. He taken a very good initiative of getting together a group of indirect tax professionals within the city to delve upon the model GST law. And when this law was published on precisely the 14th of June, and when we came across this clause कि भाई ऐसा क्या scenario होगा where goods are not required to be removed. I'll give you another example. Say for, then we were delving ऐसा थोड़ी हो सकता है. You like playing the devil's advocate कि नहीं सब गलत है law में. But जब हमने बैठ के बाद में इसके ऊपर सोचा, then there are a lot of examples that come to your mind. Say for instance that this is my rented office and I have purchased a DG set from someone, and then it's bolted to the ground and I sell the DG set as is whereas basis to the landlord. That's again goods do not require movement. So that will also come within the ambit of section 12 subsection 2. So we have discussed what will be the time of supply in cases where the goods require movement and in cases where the goods do not require movement. Very quickly then, subsection 3, which says in case of continuous supply of goods. So what do you mean by continuous supply of goods? Again, they have defined under section 2, wherein what would be termed as a continuous supply of goods. Again, I'm not getting into the definition. I think section 2 subsection 31 or 33 defines what do you mean by continuous supply of goods and also services. So there again they have divided into two parts. They say where successive statement of accounts or payments are involved, the time of supply shall be the expiry of the period to which successive statement of accounts or payments relate, and where no successive statement of accounts or payments are required, the date of issue of invoice or any other document or receipt of payment, whichever is earlier, shall be the time of supply. Anyone else who wants to leave the hall? On a count of 5, anyone else who wants to leave the hall? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. Now no one gets to leave before I leave. So the idea is one volunteer.
What is the, can you give one example what you are talking about?
Sir, I'll give you many examples, don't worry. So the idea is, when you talk about continuous supply of goods, there are two bifurcations. One, where successive statement of accounts and payments are involved. Then in that case, the expiry of the period to which it is relating will be continuous supply of goods, and where there is no such successive payment of accounts required, then they say it is the date of invoice or any document or the receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. To start with a very crude example, LPG cylinders, newspapers, milk, milk, gas, electricity. Now obviously milk may be exempted, newspapers may be exempted, but that's a very crude example where there is a continuous supply of goods. And as I said, the relevant section will also determine as to what do you mean by a continuous supply of goods. Maybe they've given a time frame. So now, another example.
So in that case there is no
Vendor managed inventory.
No, in that case there is no requirement of any invoice issue or anything.
And we'll come to the time of supply. First, we'll understand the concept of continuous supply of goods, vendor managed inventories. A lot of times it may happen that my vendor has to keep a minimum quantity of those goods at my premises, and I will draw those goods every fortnight or at the end of every month. My vendor will give me a statement that Shivani, at your office you have taken so many goods. One is vendor managed inventory. That will now fall within the ambit of continuous supply of goods. Another example, सर अब GST आपको चार्ज करेगा तब तो बताइएगा, बट मेरे हिसाब से करेगा नहीं, आपका दूध वाला आपको GST चार्ज. Milk, newspapers, these will all be in the zero rated or exempted commodity, just to give you an idea what is continuous supply of goods. So one was a vendor managed inventory, wherein goods are supplied over a period of time, and there your vendor at the end, as per the contract or period determined, will give you a statement of accounts, or as they call it, a successive payment statement. Then the expiry of that, running bills, जो account का bills होता है, then the expiry of that period, say at the 7th of the month following the month, he has to give you a statement of account, and कोई कारण से उसने नहीं दिया, so that does not mean कि उसका time of supply नहीं arise हुआ, हो गया. Why? Because the time period has expired. And in case where there is no such concept of giving a statement of accounts or a successive payment, then they say it will be as per the invoice or receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. Then they say for the purposes blah blah blah. Now they come to the concept of reverse charge. In a way, reverse charge is already there on goods in the form of purchase tax. By and large, assessees are very used to the concept of reverse charge on services. So when you talk about the reverse charge on goods, they say that the earliest of the following will determine your time of supply. A, the date of receipt of goods. Now here, you as a service, or sorry, as a recipient of supply, have to determine the time of supply to determine when you need to pay GST. So the following, the earliest of the following will be your time of supply. A, the date of receipt of goods. B, the date on which the payment is made. C, the date of receipt of invoice. And the last one is the date of debit in the books of accounts. So the earliest of the four, here you see that you really don't need to be dependent on the supplier for any information. Unlike section 12, subsection 2, wherein to determine your point of supply, you actually had to be dependent on the data to be provided by the recipient. Here in case of reverse charge of goods, they say earliest of the following, that is receipt of goods, date, again this is dependent upon your books of accounts, where they talk about the debit in the books of accounts, receipt of invoice, or the date on which the payment is made. Then they talk about the goods which are sent on approval or return basis. So here someone was saying in VAT, I think the period is 1 year or something within which the sale has to be accounted for, or within which it culminates into the transaction of sale. Now that has been curtailed to 6 months. So they say that in case where the goods are sent on approval or return basis and are removed before it is known whether a supply will take place, the time of supply shall be at the time when it becomes known that the supply has taken place, and in instances where you do not know that whether or not your goods are being accepted or not, it is 6 months from the date of removal, whichever is earlier, which is a reasonable time within which the supplier and the recipient both can determine whether or not the goods should be returned or the goods should not be returned. So there may be an instance for respective spouses. I'm talking about the male members here. You call up PC Chandra and then you say, "Bhai, ek dekh lo, madam ko dekhne do kaisa laga?" And 6 good months you are sitting. Madam has not decided whether she wants to purchase that necklace or not. Within 6 months, bhai, आप decide कर लो, नहीं तो उसको आपको GST charge करना पड़ेगा. And then they say that in cases where you cannot determine your time of supply of goods under any one of the following, under the preceding sections that we've discussed, then it is the date on which the periodical return has to be filed. This is basically for all the people which are liable to file a return or registered under GST. The date on which the return is to be filed, and in any other case, it is the date on which CGST or the SGST is paid. So this is basically a residual clause which does not cover any one of the above. So what all scenarios have we discussed under time of supply of goods? A, now I need a quick revision please. So A was supply of goods in cases goods are required to be removed. So what is the time of supply? Earliest of the 4 events. What are the 4 events? Removal, invoice, payment, recipient. And in cases where the goods are not required to be removed, only the first clause changes, that the goods are made available to the recipient as long as he can say that the goods are made available. Now you see, again, there may be litigation as to when do you say that the goods have been made available, you know. So that again may be a question of law as to how do you determine that the goods have been made available or not. But nonetheless, not getting into that level of litigation here. So that was for subsection 2. When you talk about subsection 3, it is continuous supply of goods. And when you talk about continuous supply of goods, there are again 2 parts to it. One, where successive statement of accounts or payments have to be furnished. Then what is the date of time of supply?
Issue of invoice or
The date on which invoice is
Separate.
First, I am required within the contract to submit a statement of accounts. So what will be the time of supply?
Expiry of that.
Expiry of the relative period. And when you talk about any other case, it is earlier of the 2 events, receipt of payment or invoice. Third was, again, what is continuous supply of goods? They say that the council can determine as to, even beyond the definition which is given under section 2, certain other goods may also be dealt with as being continuous supply of goods. The third one was in case of reverse charge, wherein again they say that earliest of the following 4 will determine the time of supply as far as RCM on goods is concerned, which is receipt of goods, payment, invoice and debit in my books of accounts. And then we talk about sale on approval basis. It's the time when you know that yes, the supply has been made, or a period of 6 months, whichever is
can there be
earlier.
a fourth case?
A fourth case as in?
Debit in the books of accounts that you have. I mean, without an invoice, how can you debit?
See, now I think by and large they may also be covering provision entries here. When you talk about provision entries, like, see this again as I said, when you talk about all these things, made available ki apne baat kar rahe hain. So between the supplier and the recipient, it's a matter of contract as to what is the case when the goods are made available. See, time of supply we have to understand is not the time of supply which we commonly understand. Time of supply is that concept which has been artificially created by law. And as the model GST law stands, as even Agarwalji was mentioning on some other concept of जब आप फरीदाबाद जाओ तो आप नहीं ले सकते हो. So these will be challenges that will be addressed in the new law which will come out. So even when you talk about how will on earth for a big company you will keep finding out कि भाई सामने वाले ने कब अपने books में debit दिखाया है when you talk about section 12 subsection 2. So some issues definitely will be there, but we are expectant of the fact that once the law comes in place, there will be lot of amendments to the existing law as it stands on date. Very quickly, then the last one was sale on approval, and for any other case which does not fall in the above 5 subsections, it will be the date of payment or the date on which the return is required to be filed. Now here they say the return is to be filed, the date on which the return is to be filed, not the date on which the return is filed. But when you talk about the payment part, they say when the payment is made, not when the payment is to be made. Now very quickly, and I think towards the last leg of the deliberation, is the time of supply of services. Now as I said, when you talk about the time of supply of services, this is services understood as services and goods understood as services for the limited purposes of the GST law. So like works contract will now be determined under section 13, not under section 12, and we will take that once we come to that relevant section. So here they say that the time of supply shall be A, the date on which the invoice is issued or the receipt of payment, whichever is earlier, if the invoice is issued within the prescribed time. Like as on date, this concept has been largely borrowed from the point of taxation rules. As on date, you have a time frame of 30 days from the receipt of payment or rendition of service within which you need to raise a valid invoice. Initially it was 14 days, and for banking and financial companies it is a time span of 45 days. I'm not aware of what period have they prescribed under GST, but as long as you issue an invoice within the prescribed time, then they say it is the date of invoice or the receipt of payment if the invoice is issued within the prescribed time, and if the invoice is not issued within the prescribed time, then they say it is the date of completion of service or receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. And then they again go on to say that the date on which the recipient shows the receipt of services in his books of accounts in cases where A and B does not apply. So it's a very peculiar scenario. I understood that there is a challenge when you have to find out about a tangible item like goods, कि भाई recipient ने कब दिखाया है. But even in case of services, they say where A and B does not arise, then they say the date on which the recipient shows the receipt of services in his books of accounts, that is in cases where the supplier has not issued an invoice, it will be the date on which the recipient shows the receipt on his books of accounts. Now, I've been given a prompt, so very quickly and very interestingly, when you talk about continuous supply of services, now here they want to cover items like works contract. Again, under the relevant section 2, they have defined what do you mean by continuous supply of services. But mind you friends, here they are talking about a continuous supply of service, which includes items like works contract, but not a composite contract. So a lot of times you may come across a deal wherein you buy a washing machine and you get a oven free, or you buy a Coke and you get a Kit Kat free. Will that be covered under this? Will that be a works contract? No, that will be covered under relevant section 12 because their items are goods. But say for example, where you buy a telephone and you get a voucher of say rupees 1000 for a Lakme salon, then again will it fall under this? No, you will have to bifurcate the transaction. So the goods part of it, that is in my example was a mobile, will be determined by relevant section 12, and the other part of it, which is the Lakme salon portion, will be determined under section 13. So here works contract is a service for the limited purpose of section of GST law, but this does not cover composite. Now you have a lot of deals where you get 1-to-1 free. You buy one shirt, you get the other shirt free. We will not get into the valuation aspects of it, but now that will not come under this, that will be relevant under section 12, and this will cover only continuous supply of services. Like say for example, you talk about a works contract, like someone was discussing about buying a flat from a developer. Now there may be 2 instances or 3 instances. A, the contract is such that at the 7th of the following month you have to pay him rupees 1 lakh for the next 1 year, right? There may be another scenario that your payments are not dependent upon the dates given within the contract. It is dependent upon what? Upon the completion of certain events as per the contract. भाई आपका पाइलिंग हो गया फर्स्ट फ्लोर का, आई विल गिव यू 10%. आपने यहाँ पे स्लैब लगा दिया, आई विल गिव यू अनदर 10%, राइट? So then they again go on to define that where the due date is ascertainable from the contract. In my example, as I said, for the next 1 year, at the 7th of the following month, you have to pay say 10%, right? Then they say the payment is the date on which the payment is liable to be made. That is in my example 7th of the following month. Whether or not any invoice or any other document is issued or any payment is received, that will be the time of supply. Are we clear? And where the due date of payment is not ascertainable from the contract, each such time when the supplier receives the payment or issues an invoice, whichever is earlier. And the third one goes on to discuss our second leg of the example, wherein my receipt of payment is linked with the completion of an event. The time of completion of that event will determine the time of supply. So that's how the continuous supply of services has been dealt with as far as the time of supply of services is concerned. Again, they have defined, and again they say that the council may come up as to a list of services which will be treated as continuous supply of services. And in case of supply, which is again reverse charge, they have the same concept as we had in goods, that is receipt of services, payment is made, receipt of invoice, and debit in the books of accounts. Now these will cover provision entries, like say for instance when you talk about an audit fee. So when you talk about audit, you already know that the audit will be done and then you make an entry as on 31st March, but the audit may happen in say for example June and you raise the bill in July. So maybe this is got to do with those provision entries as far as services are concerned. There they say that in case of even continuous supply of services, there these problems will arise wherein you talk about the debit in the books of accounts. Again, when you talk about the second one, in cases, okay, now they talk about another one wherein there is a contract of supply, but the services ceases under a contract before the completion of supply. Such services will be deemed to have been provided at the time when the supply ceases. So me and you entered into a contract for a supply of service, say for example retainership, but you were not very happy with the work that I did and hence there was a cessation of the contract. But you have paid me till, say for example, April, May, June, you have paid me for the month of May. Then till the period the supply ceases, till that time आपका time of supply हो जाएगा for that limited period. There is also a school of thought that May में contract खत्म हो जाने से आपको पूरे April to March का देना पड़ेगा. My view is not that. My view is that till the supply ceases, till that time that part supply which has already been made, the time of supply will set to have been occurred at the time when the supply ceases. Then there is another one which says where it is not possible to determine the supply as per the relevant sections above, then it is the date on which the periodical return is to be filed, or as we discussed, the date on which CGST and SGST payment is made. Very quickly, since there is something like an example note which is written by him, like say for example, even when you talk about the works supply of services, say for example for an AMC, right? And I did an AMC for say April, May, June, July, August, and I wasn't very happy with the work and the contract ceases as on June. But I have already paid for it in the month of April, right? So this section needs some bit of an amendment wherein this section 12, 13 section, subsection 6 applies only in cases where there is a contract between you and me, the contract ceases and the GST has not yet been paid. Because where cases GST has already been paid by virtue of time of supply being determined as the date of payment, then this section would not apply. So a little, as I said, there are a lot of amendments which will go into it. And last but not the least, they talk about the change in rate of tax in case of supply of services. This is relevant only for change in the effective rate as far as services are concerned, not for goods. Goods will continue to be determined under section 12. So a thumb rule, for the sake of brevity, I'll quickly tell you, is if the change of rate has occurred today, we are talking about a post-GST scene, and the services have been provided after the change of rate. Two events are left to be determined: payment, invoice. If both of them are prior to the change of rate, then the prior will apply. If anyone is after, then the after will apply. Likewise, if the services have been provided prior to the change of rate and both the events have occurred of raising and payment after, then the after rate applies. Anyone occurs prior, prior applies. With that, it's a wrap up, and thank you so much for listening to me with such rapt attention, and thank you to sir also for being on the dais, and good night to all of you.
Thank you, Shivani, for sharing your valuable knowledge with all of us. Now, I would like to call CA Dilip Doshi to present a memento to Mr. D.S. Agarwal. Now I would like to call Mr. R.L. Chakravarti to present a memento to C.A. Shivani Sahib. Thanks the audience to make today's workshop successful.
GST law है, ठीक है, and मैं जितना भी पढ़ी मैं सारा उसी में नोट्स है, because PPT बनवाना और उसको देख के पढ़ती हूँ, and all my आज निकलने के बाद मैं सोचती थी ऐसा अगर कि मैं किताबें पढ़ जाऊँ, and my son is not here, he's running high temperature, and meeting is just me and him because my husband is traveling, and it's a completely new place we have come.